already mentioned the Crusades so many times in videos leading up to it. We're finally here, the Crusades. Now, the word crusade comes from the Latin cruxata or cruciata, meaning crossed or marked with the cross. And this came from the custom of sewing usually a red cross symbol onto your military clothing. Now, before we get into the Crusades, we're going to go through all the Palestinian Crusades. We need to look at the various interpretations of what constitutes a crusade. There's actually 4 schools of thought regarding what constitutes a crusade. The first is the liberationist or the traditionalist. This group of scholars restricts the Crusades to the Christian campaigns to the Holy Land, either to assist the Christians there or to liberate Jerusalem. The second school of thought is the papalist or the pluralist. This school identifies any military campaign sanctioned by a valid pope at any geographic location or any time period as a crusade. So this would include not only the Crusades in the Holy Land, but also the Pope-sanctioned Albigensian Crusade in southern France, the Northern Crusades, the Hussite Wars, the wars for political and territorial advantage with the Papal States, the Crusade in Sicily, the Crusades against Frederick II, and even the re-liberation of Spain in the 1400s, and even the Crusade against King Henry III. So any war, any aggressive maneuver sanctioned by the Pope qualifies as a crusade. The third school of thought is the generalist, and this school of interpretation identifies crusades as all wars connected with the Catholic Church. So it's very general. This is a minority view. All right? This would make anything that had Catholics fighting into a crusade. Kind of ridiculous. The fourth is the popularist school of thought. And the popularists identify crusades not as papal, not as even Catholic, but rather as popular grassroots movements of religious fervor or religious aggression, such as the First Crusade or the People's Crusade or even the Children's Crusade. So those are the 4 schools of thought, the 4 interpretations on the Crusades, and for the purposes of this lesson, we'll be following the first definition, that is the traditional or the liberationist view, which sees the Crusades primarily focused on the Holy Land and on the liberation of Jerusalem. Now, before we go into the various crusades, we need to look at a map and look at the spread of Islam, beginning with the life of Muhammad and then into the 7th, 8th, and 9th century. Now, you can see on the screen a map. The red territory are all the regions that were acquired by Muhammad during his lifetime. The orange regions are the territories acquired in the late 600s after the death of Muhammad. And then the yellow territory is the territory acquired by the Muslims by the end of the 700s. You can see they're all the way across North Africa, even into Spain. And 711, as we noted in a previous lesson, is an important year because that's when the Muslims took over Spain. Now, as the Muslims reached out and expanded their territorial holdings, there was more and more pressure on various cultures, but in particular, the Christians. We, as Catholics, are a people of pilgrimage. We believe in holy places, holy sites, churches, altars, etc. And the capture of the tomb of Jesus Christ, where he rose from the dead there in Jerusalem, had great symbolic, even sacramental symbolism for the Catholic Church and continues to this day. And so there was this boiling need to go and retake it. And you'll notice, it was taken in the late 600s. It took about 400 years for there to be organized a military operation to get it back. Also notable, if you look at that map on the screen, all those regions, with maybe the exception of the southern part of Arabia, all those regions were primarily Christian before the coming of Muhammad. Okay, so onward to the First Crusade. By 1054, Rome and Constantinople were no longer in communion, as we discussed in the previous lesson, and this prevented joint military ventures against Islam. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius I requested military aid from Pope Urban II to fight against the Muslim Turks. And at the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban preached a crusade with the hope of finding reunion with Constantinople. Peter the Hermit, a popular preacher, began preaching a people's crusade to thousands of Christians, and he led them out of Europe to conquer Jerusalem and apparently to usher in the apocalypse. He even claimed to have a letter that had fallen from heaven, giving him charge for this purpose. Despite being warned by Alexios, the People's Crusade advanced to Nicaea and fell to Turkish ambush at the Battle of Civito, from which only about 3,000 people escaped. Meanwhile, the noble armies from the French and Norman soldiers, numbering about 100,000 men, embarked in August and September of 1096 and divided into 4 separate parts and were welcomed in Constantinople by the Greeks. They quickly seized Antioch with a vision from St. George, and then they moved south to Jerusalem. And on the 15th of July in 1099, they captured Jerusalem and they killed the inhabitant of Jerusalem. Now, this is a very controversial topic because apparently there was a massacre of the Muslim and the Jewish population inside Jerusalem. And at the end of this lesson, we're going to talk about how you can understand and explain the Crusades to non-Catholics and to Catholics. We have some strategies there. We're going to say that the Crusades themselves, as a defensive measure, were justified, but that the particular things that happened during the Crusades, for example, maybe this one, well, certainly this one, are not acceptable and are not falling under Catholic moral teaching. After the First Crusade, there were established 4 Crusader states or nations: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. Next comes the Second Crusade. That was from 1147 to 1149. And this was called for to recapture the County of Edessa, which fell to the Muslims in 1144. 2 great kings, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, decided to take up the cross and lead the crusade to the Holy Land. 1 year later, they laid siege to Damascus, but after failing to capture the city, the German king decided he had enough and he left the Holy Land. His French counterpart soon followed his example, and the Second Crusade came to a disappointing end. The Third Crusade is 1189 to 1192, also known as the King's Crusade because of the European monarchs who took part. This was against the Muslim general Saladin and was launched after Jerusalem fell back to the Muslim forces. Frederick I Barbarossa of Germany died on the way to the Holy Land, while Philip II departed for France due to conflicts with Richard Lionheart of England. The latter, Richard, won several notable battles, but he failed to win back Jerusalem. Before returning to Europe, however, the English king managed to negotiate free access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims. And by the way, this is the time period of Robin Hood and good King Richard. The Fourth Crusade was in 1202 and 1204. The Christians wanted to get Jerusalem, and so Pope Innocent III preached for another crusade. He raised an army of crusaders, but they never made it to the Holy Land. On their way to Jerusalem, they captured the city of Zara for Venice, and shortly thereafter got involved in the struggle for the throne of the Emperor of Constantinople. Instead of recapturing Jerusalem, which was their commission by the Pope, the Fourth Crusade ended with the Crusaders sacking the Christian city of Constantinople. And they made a little short-lived Latin Empire there in the Byzantine Emperor. But it was a great shame on the Western Church that we have Roman Catholic Christians sacking and destroying the Christian city of Constantinople. Shortly after this, in around 1212, there's what's called the Children's Crusade, and this is heartbreaking. Several thousand children walked to the Holy Land. It was believed that the knights had not been able to recapture Jerusalem because they were impure. They were lustful, they were hateful, they were vengeful, and so these children, with their innocence, it was believed, would be able to overcome the Muslims. However, most of the children died of disease and hunger before even reaching the Italian ports. Others that made it to the ports were sold into slavery and sex work. Only a few hundred were able to return home. A great tragedy for all of these children. The Fifth Crusade was from 1217 to 1221. Despite the failure of the Fourth Crusade, the popes continued to preach more crusades to the Holy Land. Pope Innocent's successor, Honorius III, managed to convince Andrew II of Hungary and Leopold VI of Austria to take up the cross and lead their armies to Jerusalem. However, they chose to start their campaign in Egypt and to come up from the south. In 1219, they captured the port of Damietta and were offered all the holy cities in return for withdrawing from Egypt. Encouraged by their success, the Crusaders refused, which proved to be a fatal mistake. The march to Cairo failed, and the Crusaders were forced to return home without capturing Egypt, Jerusalem, or any of the other previously held cities. The Sixth Crusade is 1228 to 1229. It was relatively successful. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who led the campaign, was at the time under excommunication by the Pope. Shortly after arriving in the Holy Land, Frederick II entered into negotiation with the Egyptian Sultan, who agreed to cease Jerusalem, Nazareth, Bethlehem, and other sacred cities to the Christians. Again, a win for the Catholic Church. The Seventh Crusade was 1248 to 1254. It was launched by the sainted King Louis IX, who decided once and for all to recapture the Holy Land by conquering Egypt first. This is the new strategy of the Crusaders. But just like the leaders of the Fifth Crusade, St. Louis IX succeeded to capture Damietta, but he failed to capture the key city of Cairo. In addition, he was taken captive, and they demanded ransom for the king's life. But as he prepared for a campaign to the Holy Land, he received a letter that his mother had died, and he returned back home. A failed crusade, the Seventh Crusade. The Eighth Crusade was in 1270. The French king Louis IX decided to give it another try and launched the Second Crusade. But rather than the Holy Land or Egypt, this time he chose to start his campaign in Tunis. However, disease broke out amongst his armies, and shortly after landing, the French king himself caught the disease and died. His brother, Charles of Anjou, who arrived one day before his death, immediately entered into negotiation with the Caliph of Tunis to ensure safe departure of the Crusader army. It was over. And then the final, for our purposes, crusade is the Ninth Crusade. This crusade was launched by Prince Edward of England, who had also taken part in the Eighth Crusade. After the French king's death and the departure of the Crusaders from France, Edward decided to launch his own expedition and win the glory and fame of freeing Jerusalem. However, in 1271, he landed in Acre and tried to win support for his cause, but the lack of interest in news from England about his father's illness prompted him to return back to England. With Prince Edward's departure, the attempts of the Christians in Europe to capture the Holy Land came to a definitive end. So there's an outline of the Crusades that were oriented towards Jerusalem, towards the Holy Land. What can we say about them, and how can we be apologists for the Catholic Church and explain the role of the Crusades in our history? Clearly, there are some very evil and shameful things that happened during the Crusades. It doesn't necessarily mean that every single thing was dictated and decided by the Pope or by Catholic moral teachings. Clearly, the sacking of Constantinople, the Pope was furious with the Crusaders for that. The Children's Crusade is awful. The massacre of innocents is awful. So how can we as Catholics understand these periods in our Catholic history? The first is, as I mentioned before, having a defensive war against aggressors is just, is noble. And St. Augustine talks about that there is a kind of violence that falls under the virtue of charity. If someone is attacking an innocent person and you have to use force to rescue and save that person, it's an act of charity. You're doing something good. You're doing something out of love, not out of hate or out of vengeance. So from that is extrapolated our just war theory. And we had pilgrims, we had Christians being enslaved, we had our pilgrims being molested along the way, our churches stolen, our churches shut down, our churches turned into mosques, all without agreement. And so we were the ones receiving the attack, and so we responded. And notably, it took us 400 years to put something together and fight back against Islam. So the idea of a defensive war as a crusade is noble, is just, is good, but the particulars that happened during these crusades reveal to us that not everything that men, surprise, set out to do is noble, true, or full of charity. The Catholic tradition and the Jewish tradition of the Old Testament does hold that one can virtually use physical violence for the sake of good. And if you want to learn more about that, I'd recommend that you read St. Thomas Aquinas' article. It's in the Summa Theologiae, the second part of the second, Secunda Secundae, question 64, in particular, Article 2. When someone mentions the Crusades, I think there's a two-pronged approach you need to take. First, you need to define what is a crusade. Are they saying any military action used by Catholics is a crusade? You have to show them that there are actually 4 different ways of defining what a crusade is. You have to define what we're talking about when we say the crusade, because it is a loaded term. And then the second thing you need to do is talk about the history of Islam, the defensive nature of the Crusades, and then I think as Catholics we can, as John Paul II and other popes have said, we can apologize on behalf of our ancestors, on behalf of those who represented the church, although in a faulty way, and say, yes, atrocities, sins, immoral things did happen, and we don't approve of that. Now, we can't approve of a defensive measure against Islam. We don't approve of the abuses. And like so many good things in this world, including the Catholic Church, which is it's the body of Christ. It's the institution through which grace flows. It's the family of God. But yet, even in the Catholic Church, great crimes have happened. And so we as Catholics are able to make that distinction between the idea in the institution and then the sins of its members. And I think that's the best way to understand the history of the Crusades, beginning with the first one all the way down unto the end. Well, hey, thanks for being a member of the New St. Thomas Institute, and we'll see you in the next lesson. God bless you.